functioning board, I think, some people may say, Anna-Marie, are you not making too big an issue of the board? Is a board not just really a ceremonial body structure that, is supposed to get together 4 times a year, have a nice lunch, not a few times, and go home? What are you really expecting from a board? Then more than that. That's what we thought the big role. And of course, complain when the parking is not right. That's what our experience is of our board. So does a board really have an impact? Does a board influence the performance of a company? Can it influence the performance of a company? And in response to those questions, I'm going to rely on the study that was done in 2013 on the root causes of 40 corporate disasters. And basically, the bottom line that the study came to was to say all of those root causes that they had identified in the study emanated from the boardroom. Now, that already tells you a lot. It tells you, yes, number one, a board does have an impact. And it can be either a good impact or it can be a bad impact. But there is a very definite impact that the board has. And so if we can, just for purposes of today's discussion, if we can just agree on that the board does play a critical role and does have an impact, then what do we do? How do we help boards to actually make a good impact, to add value, to be effective? I know I serve as chair of a non-profit company, and the other day the CEO was asking me to also speak to the staff. He said, because the staff is asking as well, what impact is the board making? What is the role of the board? So if we want a board to make an impact, if we want a board to be seen and be visible and having a positive impact, what does it take? Or to put it in the way, the heading, I'm reminded of a heading of a publication in the Harvard Business Review 20 years ago that said, what makes great boards great? And again, I think there are quite a number of elements and dynamics and factors that we can talk about. So considering the time that we have available, I'm going to ask our guest speakers that we focus on 3 very specific items. And I'm taking my cue for these items from the 3 top root causes that were identified by the study that I've just referred to earlier on. And those 3 root causes were, 1, the non-executive director's skills and influence. In other words, to put it more bluntly, who's in the room. The second one was the blindness of the board to risk, understanding the business and understanding the risk to the business and to themselves. And the third one that we're going to touch on this afternoon is the defective information, the flow of information to and from the board, and that information being defective. So those are going to be our 3. There are others. I mean, just the leadership on ethos and culture in the organization, the risk that's introduced by the complexities, kind of a good example, the complexities of the structures that makes it so difficult for a board to be in so-called effective control of the business, how we incentivize management, our remuneration structures, a dominant or a charismatic personality in the boardroom, all of those obviously also impacts on the function of the board. And each of them are topics, I think, in their own right that we can have a conversation on. But for purposes of today, let's focus on who's in the board, what's the risk, how do they deal and manage the risk and the flow of information. So Teresita, welcome. You can unmute yourself because I'm going to say, so number 1, again, thank you for your time. As I've said before, welcome. It's great having you on board. You're a seasoned, experience. I know you spent quite a few years as the LID on the board of Westcol as well. And I know you had your work cut out there for you as well. So you have practical experience. So share with us a little bit your views on board composition and in particular, the non-executive director in the boardroom.
So good afternoon, everybody, and thank you, Anna-Marie. Hi, Geoff. Good to be here with you. I thought I'll draw a parallel between government and boards and talk about the preparedness or unpreparedness of government in terms of the current pandemic, and how hugely this has had an impact, a detrimental impact on health and the finances of the population and globally. And similarly, from a board composition point of view, the board is at the center of risk management, as you correctly put it. And in our time, so many company disasters have been put to the dysfunctional nature of a board, while at the same time there's thousands of successes that can be also attributed to the great work of the board. And so having that balance is important. And the set of skills that is in the board is without a doubt the secret ingredient. And the level of independence that is required indeed is an answer to that ability to make the board functional and in total control, or absolute, not in terms of the control of the organization and its path, to see the strategy and to have the right ingredients in terms of skills for the directors to guide the organization in that direction. So from a non-executive director, the importance of time available, because of the distance that there should be between the actual operations and the non-executive director, the time that is allocated by the person and the responsibility that comes with such an appointment needs to be taken into consideration right from the start. The science of recruitment for the diversity in the board is very definitely a primary action by the organization to enable a board to be effective. And as times change, to be flexible and agile enough to adapt the organization and its strategy through the right skill set within the board is critical to sustainability and to continuity, as has been illustrated in recent times by this incredible pandemic and its outcomes that we are suffering. So for me, the non-executive director is a key ingredient in the board composition, and one that has the time, the skills, and the independence to complement the decisions that are made by the board.
Thank you for that, Teresita. I appreciate that intro. Geoff, welcome. Thank you as well. You've got many board meetings around you right as we speak, and you just came out of one. So thank you for taking the time. Your views around board composition and the impact of that on a well-functioning board?
Thank you, Anna Marie, and thank you for my inclusion. Thanks to Teresita for her introduction. I fully agree with what's been said. And really, when one looks at a board, it really is back to basics. How's the board been inducted? Who are the people you're inducting? What are the different skills? And the skill sets will vary from company to company, depending on how you want to run. Leadership is also terribly, terribly important. Your chairperson, your relationship with the executive committee, and as Teresita has mentioned, not crossing that line between operational and strategic is terribly important. But what one finds is that just the simple things of regular communication, papers going out on time to the directors, application by the directors to those papers so that they are ready for their board meetings and that they have input. All those sort of things which are so basic are just important if you're going to have a well-functioning board. The ability of the chairperson to use the talent of all the people within that boardroom so that you get all the valued experience that the different people have had. It's often questioned as who should be in the boardroom. Obviously, there's certain parties that are always in the boardroom, your CEO, your CFO, and then there are so many other elements that you can talk about. You can talk about IT, you can talk about communications, marketing, and it will vary from company to company. Obviously, skills within the industry that you are involved in. But one of the biggest things for a director is, number one, to know what they've got to comply with in terms of what the Companies Act says, what the different legislation says. If you're in a state-owned enterprise, you need to be aware of the PFMA and other legislation that affects your industry. So you've got to have the background knowledge, you've got to have the company knowledge, and you've got to be able to apply yourself, speak at the right time, and give strategic direction to the company. There must also never be the fear of speaking up and being victimized, and that is the role of a competent chairperson to make sure that that always happens. But I cannot stress sufficiently the timeous flow of information to all directors, and that they are kept informed as they are agents of the company. And the other point that was also mentioned earlier is that the company in toto should know exactly who their board directors are, and the directors should have an appreciation not only of just the company, the executive, but also the staff that work within the organization, so that they are adequate ambassadors and not just figureheads.
Thank you for that intro, Jess. Teresita, maybe I forgot to just mention this, I should have done this at the start, to our participants, because we're on a new platform. If you want to, you're very welcome again, like previously, to pose questions. Do so, use the public chat function for that. I will keep my eye on that and try at the end to just refer some of your questions to both Geoff and Teresita for their response. So you're welcome to do that. On this topic about the NED skills and experience, I want to just respond and maybe touch on one or two of the things that you have raised, both Geoff and Teresita. I think number one, and that's why I'm so passionate probably about the training that I do with directors, because I must tell you, in my 30 years of growing up in the boardrooms of South Africa, both in public and private sector, I am really sometimes taken aback by the level, and I'm going to use a crude word, of ignorance, the lack of understanding of that basic universe, Geoff, that you were talking about, just the basic understanding of, as a director, what the rules of engagement are around the constitution of the company, the statutes, and I'm not saying we must all be qualified senior counsel in those things, but to have a basic understanding of the law and what the law says around what is expected from me as a director, and just the basic governance, in how we govern board meetings, shareholders meetings. I still have directors that I speak to even today that believe that there is a statutory requirement to have board meetings, for example, confusing, king recommendations about how often a board should meet with now what the law requires. And that in itself is a concern. So I think that just getting that basic understanding. The other thing is, for me, that you touched on, both of you, I think, and Teresita in particular, the independence. I was, Geoff, I think you were on the call yesterday as well, when the Good Governance Academy, that is the brainchild of Professor Mervyn King, where he's trying to influence the content of MBA material with business schools as well, to really create conscious leaders in our society. We had a webinar yesterday on integrated reporting, and the question was posed about saying, well, we're talking about all the great things about integrated reporting and integrated thinking, but look at the scoreboard. We've got all of these spectacular, I think was the word that was used, spectacular disasters. And, what does it help to have more frameworks and recommendations? And the comment was made, you are quite right. It is about the people in the room. We can write King reports till we're blue in the face. If we don't have the right people ethical, effective leaders in our boardrooms. And Geoff, you touched, very specifically on the role of the chair. And then last thing before I pose some questions to you that I want to raise on this as well is the skill set. So another point that was made yesterday that stood out for me was one of the speakers saying, guys, we have to accept it's not going to be business as usual anymore. We, the word I think that Teresita used was agile, the agility. We are going to have to really relook the way we run our businesses. And for that reason, we need fresh thinking in our boardrooms. Now, we're not going to get fresh thinking in our boardrooms tomorrow, but we've got to start somewhere to get that. Geoff, how do we start planning around reinventing, if that's the right word, our boards to be agile and to be ready for what's lying ahead?
I think that one of the most important things, we're all being exposed at the moment to the COVID pandemic, which has had devastating effects, not only on South Africa and South African companies, big and small, but we're also being exposed to the weather patterns and the population of the earth. And the awareness of all these developing criteria and the risk factors that relate to our businesses are so important. And I think you as a director, not only have you got to be involved in the company and what the company does, but you've got to be aware of the environment, both within your country and around the world, of how that's going to affect you. You've got to be mindful when we talk about the integrated reporting and integrated thinking of the different elements of society. Should we call it the humans, the environment itself, and the profit factor? And you've got to take all those into account as you think and build a business. What was very heavily commented on in the webinar yesterday was the fact that if you've got employees and they can't get to work, problem. If you haven't got access to water and you need water, problem. And all those sort of things need to be considered in the risk factors of your business. So the risk profile of the company is terribly, terribly important. Another thing, just to go back on what was mentioned a little bit earlier, is the role of the board secretary. The board secretary has a tremendous responsibility insofar as the induction is concerned of directors and keeping them up to date with all the latest developments. And the latest developments are not just what happens on the corporate front or on the King front. It's also about world events that affect the company. So I cannot stress how important the role of a board secretary is, that we remain within the tracks that we should be in, but also that our minds are expanded to think of the risks that we need to consider.
Thanks, Geoff. Teresita, your views, and I want to ask you to also specifically talk a little bit around diversity. I know you will, as well, the JSE last year came out with, having revisited the listing requirements, saying in the past we spoke about board diversity on race and gender, but guys, we want you to report on a broader spectrum of diversity. How does diversity impact the functioning of a board, and specifically composition then as well?
Very definitely, in terms of diversity, the field is well broadened. And in terms of skills, gender, and also in terms of the international scene, as Geoff was talking about, how we are at the moment dealing with the, let's call it the license to operate, as an example. It demands that there is absolute focus on not only the skill set, which now has to also include, I would say, entrepreneurship is a very important addition to the skill set that is required. In terms of women advancement, we see a significant drive and research that has proven exactly how the presence of women in leadership echelons has enabled better results and a lot more humanity and new solutions. So the diversity that is pledged is increasing in let's say in the way in which it translates to the very point that Geoff made earlier in terms of how we deal with the world changing, the planet and the climate change. All of that together calls for a rethink and a evolution of how the board is composed and how the board is trained. That point you made, Anna-Marie, in terms of yesterday's workshop is critical, that earlier in the formation of professionals and future directors, there is a good dose of directive, of development of what we used to call soft skills, for example. And as you mentioned recently, is now essential capabilities in a person. The leadership, the quality of the leadership and the chairmanship in itself, from a diversity point of view, dictates the progress, or at least the success of the board to compose itself in a way that is ready and able to deal with the problems ahead.
Thanks. I think what we all are trying, all three of us are saying also, is that, guys, having an effective board it's not an informal process. You need to, it's an application of mind also to the composition of who's in the room. And you know, I was thinking yesterday, thinking about all the social issues, Geoff, that you just mentioned, you know, access to water, all of those kind of things. Every board, and there we can't give the answer, but I think the takeaway for our participants from this specific topic on any of these skills is, number one, note that the people in the room are critical for the successful functioning of the board. It sounds to me like I'm saying something that's common sense and should be, you know, go without saying, but let me say that, make that point. It is critical. So how they come into who we and how we identify them, how we, you know, search for candidates and how they nominate it, all of those things are critical in building the right board. And we can't, and this is, I think, every board also needs to apply its mind, and nominations committee. What are those critical skills that this needs to be in the boardroom? What are those skills that we can source in through consultants and in other ways? But what is the building block that we, because size was something, Geoff, Teresita, and Geoff, maybe it's just a quick question. We touched on size yesterday. What is the ideal size of a board? And then I'm going to, with that, you know, pose a question that was asked on the public chat around, you also, and it goes to Teresita's point about availability of time. You have people that sit on various boards. And yes, we can't put a number, and we've always resisted as the King Committee to put a limit on the number of boards, because it depends on the size of the organization, the complexity, you know, whether it's listed, it's non-listed, and. So it's difficult to put a number to it. But you do find sometimes that, let's say, for argument's sake, an individual will serve on a number of listed boards. And if you think to Teresita's point about availability of time, you know, can we really make a valuable contribution as an individual? Geoff?
Yes, thank you for that. I think the biggest thing that one has to be is you need to be, that availability is terribly important. If you cannot give sufficient time to be at meetings on a regular basis. And another thing as we go along, I also want to mention is confidentiality within meetings, which to me is absolutely critical. And also the thought of yourself and your conflict of interest, to disclose that at all times. I think those things are terribly important. So you've got to be careful when you go on more than one board as to whether you are compromising yourself and whether you have, as is mentioned again and again, the time and the ability to apply yourself. What size should it be? Difficult to put it into numbers, but I would feel that when you get up to 10 members and start going over that level, and with everybody wanting to contribute, it makes board meetings rather difficult to handle. I wouldn't give a specific as to too big or too small, but I'd say up to 10 is good. Over 10 becomes a challenge.
Thanks, Geoff. Teresita, let's use that number 10. Now, considering everything we've said about diversity, about skills, about the agility, the new norm that we're going to have to face, how, just in very quickly, if you were to had to go about building a board for a company, how would you do that?
Yeah, earlier we mentioned the science of recruitment, and you brought the nominations committee into play. And I think that through the King requirements, for example, is interesting to understand the dynamics that the cross collaboration of committees brings to this particular subject in terms of understanding that the board has commissioned the committees and they are able to deal more deeply into specific subjects and therefore understand a lot more of the relationship between the strategy and the risk management and the executive team and the reality on the ground. And so therefore the communication allows for the board to understand the requirements better and to think outside of the box, to deal with a life that is changing and a business that is changing. There is no more the standard approach. There is a new normal just about every day. And Geoff also mentioned yesterday that it is very difficult to change composition rapidly, but it is very important that continuous surveillance, if you wish, or self-assessment is not a once-a-year type of process, but rather a continuous process in consultation with the different committees that allows the nominations committee to work more effectively, that also allows the prevention of gaps and exposures and additional risks that arise from, let's say, insufficient or even dated skills. And then also it's important to understand that there is a pipeline that needs to exist. Recruitment and human capital applies to the board as well. And the same principles should be utilized to be able to manage the future and to enable the present.
Now, I think that's a very valid point. And I think the point, my takeaway from what you've just said, Teresita, really also the use of board committees more effectively, that there's more an application of mind on what committees we have. And it touches, with that point, I want to roll into our second topic around risk. And just your comment on committees as well. So that second root cause that was identified was the board's blindness to risk. Geoff, and I want to talk to you on risk because I'm sharing my very cynical, experience out there in the streets or in the boardrooms. Audit and risk committee. In the majority of audit and risk committees that I'm involved in, audit gets 75, 80%, if not more of the time. And risk is sort of the stepchild on the agenda, last 15, 20 minutes. Let's quickly do it. And we've looked at risk. So I don't think we're doing ourselves favor as a board when it comes to risk, and we are setting ourselves up for failure by doing that. What's your views on how the board's blindness to risk?
Well, I suppose the first thing I should say about risk is an everyday challenge and should be embraced by the organization and the people responsible in the organization for the different risks. It's not a once-a-year assessment, and the oversight should come from the board. So the presentation of the risk dynamics and what they should be formulated by the executive committee and approved by the audit committee, who should apply their mind to how risk is progressing. In exactly the same way that we talk about an integrated report not being a once-a-year exercise, we talk about it being an everyday experience. I feel exactly the same way about risk. And maybe at this stage, I should also bring up that one of the biggest things that face us today is that we have a variety of different types of companies. And in the state-owned enterprise space, one of the biggest things that is happening is, where does the board fit in? Does the board have the responsibility that it should have, and can it make the decisions that it needs to make? Or is there outside interference? And that brings me back to, where does the board fit in? Who appoints the board? What is their responsibility? And do they execute on that responsibility? And coming back to risk, the risk of not being able to exercise your responsibility is an incredibly high risk. And that sits with all members, in my mind, who sit on state-owned enterprises.
Yeah, I hear you on that. It's really around not only the business risks that we blind to sometimes, it's also our personal risk that we sometimes blind to, not appreciating the implications of some of the, what we find both in public and private sector, in my experience, call it interfering shareholders, for example, or other, material stakeholders that could interfere in board decision making and activities and functioning. Teresita, your views around risk and the board's approach to risk?
So we've discussed during this time a couple of times about integration, and the word integration is particularly important. And there is also, I would say, an evolution in the thinking that needs to take place in how the integration between the board's duties and the relationship with the executive team, in fact, go together to minimize or mitigate risk, and at the same time, the responsibility of identifying the risk. The responsibility also of enabling the organization to manage risk as a daily bread item. I agree with Geoff wholeheartedly that it is a daily challenge. And until such time as such culture permeates right through the ranks, and we talk about risk as we talk about bottom line, as we talk about productivity, as we talk about performance, until such time as that is achieved, risk will always be a shadow hanging over. And so from a board point of view, promoting this culture is probably one of the highest tasks and the least spoken about, definitely. It becomes a little bit of a challenge as a conversation between the board and the executive often. And that needs to be addressed as a fundamental requirement, as an expected outcome through the lens of the shareholder. This is preventive. And it can be done, especially in this moment where we live in a crisis and we striving together to come out of the crisis. Is a perfect moment to bring about a different way of thinking about risk.
Yeah, thanks, Teresita. Maybe, Shirley on the comments made the point that banks, and I know in terms of the Banks Act, they are required to have separate risk committees. And I know when I do my training with directors or company secretaries, and I suggest the idea of a separate risk committee, the people from the financial industry in the room look at me like, I'm from a different planet. Like, doesn't everybody have separate risk committees? And it's like a big surprise to them to find, no, it's only them that are required by law to have separate risk committees. But maybe, it's become time for us to really push more for risk committees to be separated from audit committees, because I just think from the complexity on financial reporting, and what is really needed from a broader risk perspective, I think, in the interest of any board who wants to be well functioning, they need to give more airtime to risk in their committee structures. And it's going to touch on our next topic around flow of information, because the flow of information is also in the board structures between between the committees. But yeah, and you know, again, how does a board member challenge what's on the table if they don't understand the industry? You know, how do you challenge the risk assessment of management if you don't know what questions to ask? But I also want to just make this little observation to say, as a board member, trust your gut. Because, you know, I've just sometimes found that it's the innocent, what you think is questions because of your lack of understanding, that becomes then the topic matter of a huge debate. Yes. Just because you know you followed your instinct about something not looking right. Teresita?
Very definitely. I think that as a takeaway is an important thought, Anna-Marie, is that often you find that the most simple of questions are the key to unlocking some of the hidden risks. And therefore the courage to ask them is certainly an incredible weapon in terms of adding value and making the organization stronger. But timely, from a non-executive point of view, timely, accurate information is important to everybody on the board, but to the non-executive in particular, to be able to actually apply your mind in good time, to be able to ask the right questions, and then coming back to skills as the foundation, to be able to gauge the response and to be able to assess the response for its validity. Are situations that are enabled by the quality and the timing of the information that is distributed. And that should be, in fact, it is so critical to the functioning of the board that it should be, in fact, a KPI. It should be a performance measure of the executive team as to how and when does the information flow. Of course, today we have technology, and therefore access it seems easier, or certainly more accessible information that can be, let's say, probed. It is much better today. Nevertheless, it is important to be able to ask the questions and to assess the response on a continuous basis. The technology is an important tool, but the timely distribution and the continuous access for transparency, for trust, for the ability to, in fact, make a real contribution towards risk mitigation is critical. From a shareholder point of view, I think that should be a requirement of companies, like Geoff said, big and small. The affordability of digital assistance is increasingly accessible to all companies, and that should be a requirement for a shareholder.
So, Geoff, I want to go into the topic on flow of information because there's some practical issues that I want to touch on there. But before we step off, just quickly to deal with one or two of the comments and questions that came through. Geoff, so I'm going to put you on the spot and relate to you Trevor's question about what do you think is, and again, it's one of those that I know as the King Committee we've ducked and dived on, so I'm going to really put you on the spot. But is there something like this is an optimum time for a person to serve on a board? Is there like, okay, 10 years and you should be out, or for 20 years you've overstayed your welcome, or 2 years and it's time for new blood? What's your personal views on that? And just knowing that, I mean, there's not a hard and fast answer on that one.
Trevor, as a person who served on some boards for longer than I should have, I would say as long as the passion and the application is there, it's very hard to give an answer. You know, many of us get tired when we go through the same situation again and again. I think if you have the ability as an individual to apply yourself and give the company value, I don't think that a time period is the answer as to when you should be stepping up or stepping down. So that would be my answer on that.
Yeah, that's a difficult one, Geoff. So you wanted to make another comment?
Yeah, I think that the very important thing, and this is going back a moment to what Teresita had to say about information flow. What I wanted to say on that is that usually as a board of directors, you have the ability to get outside information or outside experience or call experts in. And I think all too often this is not availed of. We've got to realize as individuals where our expertise lies and what we don't know. And again, comes back to the board secretary to say there are certain training elements that should be shared with this board, and so that they can expand their knowledge. And the board, as I say, has a right in most boards to be able to ask for outside experience in whatever sphere it is. And I think all too often, agendas are far too long. The way that packs are presented are voluminous. Therefore, you can't apply your mind in the way you should. And as a result, you waste time on matters which should be handled quickly and expediently. And therefore, you don't leave sufficient time for all the matters that should be addressed. So the compilation of a board agenda, its accuracy, its succinctness is all terribly important to you having sufficient time to give time not only to the organization, but also to strategy, which is what you're supposed to be there for. And I think too often, in my experience, board meetings run too long. And as a result, things are not handled the way they should be, and many items are not handled timeously.
Thanks. I want to move into flow of information, but just on the issue around period as well, I want to say, Mervyn King coined the concept, I think, or the term of intellectual honesty. And this is the problem. And again, going to the point about, it's the people and it's about the leadership and the individuals in the boardrooms, to set a specific time period. You could have unintended consequences that could be more harmful, do more harm than good. It is for a board, to Teresita's point, there's got to be thinking, planning. It's the same succession planning, refreshing the board. You need the balance of institutional knowledge and new thinking coming in. All of those factors, the honest view of board members about an individual's contribution. And Teresita, I want to be, and then I'm going to talk about the flow of information a little bit more in 5 minutes. But on that point, there was a question that came in from Mike about, what you do and what's the process if you feel that a non-executive director's independence has been compromised. In your role as the lead independent director at, for example, Westcol and other places, how do you deal with that sort of situation?
I think on a number of levels, the concern is definitely something that needs to be addressed and needs to be investigated. And there, of course, there is levels of consultation, not only with the individual, but also in terms of where the discomfort has arisen from. Where is the source of the discomfort coming from? And there are a number of people, including the company secretary, that here is critically important, that is able to not only use methodology, but in fact offer from a base of knowledge and understanding, and including the law and including the protocols that apply, the ethics code. King is critical to that. There are so many ways in which one should apply a level of measure and performance review, but it cannot be ignored. Even if it is corridor talk, it is something that needs to be addressed and needs to be taken seriously from the word go.
No, I hear you, and I think this comes to point of Geoff, the role of the chair again, very critical. And when the chair is, which I have had in my life as well, where the chair is the compromised person, then the need for an LID. And in previous, just as a matter of interest, in previous King reports, we used to say, if the chair is not independent, you should have an LID. But with King 4, we made the point that even if the chair is independent, there could be situations of potential conflict between the chair and the board. And so, as a matter of course, have an LID in your board, to deal with those sort of sensitive issues. And I have particular experience of where that has really worked well to diffuse, potential situation for the chair and and the board as a whole. So very, very critical. I want us to, in the last few minutes before I'm going to ask Frick to wrap up for us, and Shirley, I'm noting your comments here on from a risk point of view and the focus on your risk, your chief risk officer and your risk staff, and I can't agree with you more. But I want to just ask the question to Geoff, to you, and then Teresita. Is 4 quarterly board meetings a year sufficient? Is it time that we relook? Geoff, you made the point about board meetings being too long, and. So what is the answer? Do we have more board meetings, shorter board meetings? How do we facilitate? And maybe can I just make this point too? I remember Rick Cottrell, who's long since passed away, but lovely man and a very experienced board member as well. And he was sitting on a few boards, and I asked him one day, how does he make a decision which board invitations he accepts and which ones he declined? And he said, Anne-Marie, it's very simple. I asked myself only one question: can I trust the management? And so to Teresita, to your point, that relationship between board and management, and can we trust the information coming from management? Geoff, just board meetings, how do we use board meetings effectively for flow of information?
I think if the documents are correctly prepared and you've got summaries from management on detailed documents which can be read if the board member chooses to do so, that immediately shortens the amount of time somebody's got to spend, and they can apply their mind. They can make the decision as to whether they want to go into the long detail of a voluminous report or whether the executive summary is sufficient. And that comes down very, very clearly to the trust of one another. Another point that we haven't really raised today, which is terribly important, is reputation. The reputation of the company, the reputation of the directors is paramount. And, we have a look, as you will say, at many of the failed organizations, and we'll see that there are some names who we would never in our wildest dreams have thought would be associated with those downfalls. But sitting on those boards with best intent, those people somehow became involved with the downfall of those companies. And I'm extremely mindful as an individual of the fact that wherever you sit, you're associated with, and therefore you've got to make sure at all times that your reputation, that you have regard to your reputation. I can't give you an answer of how you should act or what you should or shouldn't be doing. But one's got to be ever mindful of that, because if the right things don't happen, you've got a problem. And this overrunning of board meetings is a critical element which needs to be addressed. I do not think we need to have more board meetings. I think that where there's the necessity for more board meetings because the company dictates on certain matters that have got to be dealt with urgently, you have an extra board meeting. But to just elongate your board meetings because things are not efficiently handled is not the answer for me.
Teresita, before I ask you, this whole issue around flow of information for us as well is something that in our capacities where we have sat in board meetings as company secretaries have noticed, identified as such a huge factor, both positive and negative, that even sort of as Flirt Rock, we have a workshop that we call Flow of Information, where we talk to boards and management about how they structure flow of information to address this point as well. What's your view around that? Around how do we deal with this critical thing around information?
I think communications is a science and is definitely a focus area for everyone in leadership roles. And so the amount of or the number of board meetings that may be required also changes in the light of the quality and the frequency of the information and how the relationship is between the, let's say, the detail in the information and the last board meeting. There is often some lack of continuity or cohesion in the way the communication is coming out. And so sometimes that is the cause of more board meetings. But certainly in terms of the business model, in terms of the life cycle of the company, you have different requirements and more meetings as a result of the activity, the level of activity. If the company is in an acquisitional trail, it is inevitable that you're going to be required a lot more. So I'm not sure that there is a specific formula that works universal, but I do know that the quality of the communication goes a long way to keep the thing in check and to be able to also know that everybody is in fact in control of their own portfolios. Is part of the quality of the information that is distributed, and the timeliness of it being distributed is also a reflection of certain symptoms that are warning signs.
I think, and thanks for that. And before I hand over to Frick to just touch on a few of the key takeaways from today and to thank the two of you as well. From my point of view, I think what we've said to one another today as well is just, I think it's really, I can link it back to King 4, is to say, guys, number one, understand what the role of a board is. So swim in your lane, as my good colleague Renelle will always say, swim in your lane. If you understand what your role is as being that contributor to strategy most of all, then who must be in that board? What's the ideal makeup of my board? When I have that sorted out, how do I, to your point, Teresita, have the right committee structure? And how do I have the right delegation to management? And how do I manage? And let's think out of the box. Flow of information does not only have to happen for purposes of meetings. There could be in between meetings flow of information to keep it's building, to Geoff's point, it's building that trust. So guys, I think what we're trying to say today, take away, and Frick, I'm going to ask you to summarize that, but that having a well-functioning board is not an informal process. You need to apply your mind to different aspects, some of which that we've touched on today. From my side, Teresita, Geoff, I've really enjoyed our engagement. Frick, I'm going to ask you to summarize and close up for us. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna-Marie. Teresita, Geoff, thank you so much. You gave me an immensely difficult task here. You have thrown so many gems into this conversation that I found it very hard to bring them all together. So, but I will try my best and not to repeat what you've said. I think in the beginning, when Anna-Marie asked in terms of impact in the introduction, Teresita, you said in terms of the NED, the time, the independence, and the skills in making decisions is extremely important. And what I heard from Geoff on that same question, kind of three things: getting back to basics, and then the social factors that impact and how we respond on them as a board. And I want to link that, Anna-Marie, to your conversation where you almost said that this sounds like a question that you shouldn't ask, and that is the job of the board rests on the shoulders of the people in there. What are they there to do? They are there to do what the board is required to be done. So in that sense, how they respond to that and with the mindsets and the worldviews that they bring to the table, it's extremely important. Then also, you also referred to the chair and the responsibility of the chair, which I think is very important because it's in the chair's space to maximize the directional contributions of those sitting around the table. And not just to be decisive, but to be open-minded and courteous and allow people a voice, which links to the question that you asked Teresita asking in terms of the skills of the non-executive director, which is someone that needs to be independent, someone that understands there's a difference between my role as a manager from outside of the board where I may be and my role as a director in this organization, and I need a different set of skills here. I'm not here to manage, but I'm here to give oversight, to challenge constructively, what is happening. And for that, I need a space where I can voice, where I have psychological safety to speak my mind, and where the chair allows me and actually facilitates that kind of conversation. Then you spoke about the risks. And what I gathered from that is a risk is an enterprise-wide challenge, and the oversight is immense. And it's not just on the board side, but it's in that relationship between board and the executives. And one has to know the boundaries in that. But it's also important, if I understood you correctly, that each party understands not just the boundary, but that there is a lot of trust between both parties in managing that risk, which cannot just sit with one or the other. It is enterprise-wide, and it should be carried in that responsibility enterprise-wide. From the flow of information, what I gathered from that is the quality of information that you emphasized, Teresita, because that, you say, mitigates a lot of what's happening. And the time, in terms of how many times we have to come together as a board, there is a kind of a regular rhythm of the company. And then you indicated that there could be challenging times, like in times of acquisition, etc., that demands a different rhythm in the company. But in all of this, the flow of the information, the quality, and then especially the point that one of you made, I'm not entirely sure who, the cohesion of flow of information between different board meetings. If that is well controlled and well managed, then it also helps in terms of the number of boards that you need, because you can deal with it diligently based on accurate information, based on the trust of those that have supplied the information. But that's the best I can do in summarizing what you have said. I know it doesn't do you justice at all, but we will have to listen to the whole recording to really make sense of that. But thank you so much, much appreciated. Thank you, Annemarie.
Thank you, Frick, Geoff, Teresita, once again from my side. Thank you for your valuable input. It is really, it's that experience that we pick up in the University of Life. that really at the end of the day is and that talks to also Teresita, those essential skills and the EQ that we bring to the boardroom, that is becoming even more important than the degree, the graduation photo on our walls. So from my side, thank you for the questions we've had. Thank you for the participation from our participants as well. Thank you everybody for joining us. Frick, we're looking forward to the 4th of June. And talking to our offshore partner, Sabrina, and I was wishing you all well for the rest of what's left of this week, Friday, the weekend, and good luck. Thank you so much. Have a lovely afternoon.
Great privilege. Thank you.
And to me too, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.